Anneliese Michel was born on September 21, 1952, in a small rural town in Bavaria, Germany. The town of Liebelfing was quiet, peaceful, and deeply traditional. Life there moved slowly. Most families knew each other, and religion played a central role in everyday living. Anneliese grew up in a strict Roman Catholic household where faith was not just a belief, but a way of life. Her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, were devout Catholics. They raised their children with strong moral values, discipline, and a deep respect for the church. Anneliese was the second of 4 daughters. From a very young age, she was known to be kind, gentle, and sensitive. Teachers described her as intelligent and hardworking. Neighbors remembered her as a polite and quiet girl who rarely caused trouble. There was nothing unusual about her childhood. She went to school, helped her mother at home, played with her sisters, and attended church regularly. Like many young girls, she had dreams of becoming a teacher one day. She enjoyed music and reading. To everyone around her, she seemed completely normal, a shy but happy teenager with a bright future ahead. However, beneath this ordinary surface, the seeds of a tragedy were slowly beginning to grow. The first strange incident. In 1968, when Anneliese was 16 years old, something happened that would change her life forever. One night, while she was sleeping, she suddenly woke up unable to move. Her entire body felt paralyzed. She later described it as if a heavy invisible force was pressing down on her chest. She tried to call out for help, but no sound came from her mouth. She could barely breathe. After a few minutes, the feeling passed, but she was left terrified and confused. At first, her family thought it was just a nightmare, or perhaps stress from school. No one imagined that it was the beginning of something far more serious. But a short time later, the same thing happened again. This time, the episode was stronger. Her body became stiff and rigid. Her limbs shook uncontrollably. She lost awareness of her surroundings. When it was over, she felt weak and exhausted, as if all energy had been drained from her. Concerned, her parents took her to a doctor. Medical explanations began. The doctors examined Anneliese carefully. After several tests, they diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can cause seizures, hallucinations, and unusual sensations. At the time, this diagnosis seemed reasonable. Many of her symptoms matched the medical description of epilepsy. She was prescribed medication and told that with proper treatment, she could live a normal life. For a short period, things appeared to improve. The family felt relieved. They believed the problem had been identified and was now under control. But that hope did not last long. Over the next few months, Anneliese's condition slowly began to worsen instead of getting better. The gradual change in behavior. By 1969, Anneliese was experiencing more frequent seizures. But along with the physical symptoms, something else began to happen. Something that medicine could not easily explain. She started to complain about strange sensations. She told her parents that she sometimes heard whispering voices when no one was around. At first, these voices were faint and unclear, like distant echoes. Doctors assumed these were simply hallucinations caused by epilepsy. Then she began to experience severe depression. Once a cheerful and hopeful girl, she became withdrawn and anxious. She lost interest in school and social activities. She felt constantly afraid, though she could not explain exactly why. At night, she suffered from terrifying dreams. She claimed that dark figures appeared in her room while she slept. Sometimes she woke up screaming, saying that something evil was watching her. Her parents grew more and more worried. Life as a struggling student. Despite her health problems, Anneliese tried to continue with her education. She was determined not to let her illness destroy her dreams. In 1970, she enrolled in the University of Würzburg to study teaching. But university life proved extremely difficult. The stress of studies seemed to make her condition worse. She had trouble concentrating. Her seizures became more frequent. She felt exhausted all the time. Friends noticed that she was becoming increasingly nervous and unstable. During this period, doctors changed her medications several times, hoping to find something that would help. Strong anti-seizure drugs were prescribed, along with psychiatric treatments, yet nothing seemed to bring real improvement. Instead, new and more disturbing symptoms began to appear, the first signs of something unusual. Around 1972, Anneliese started reporting experiences that frightened even the doctors. She claimed that during prayer, she felt an intense hatred toward religious objects. This was shocking because she had always been deeply faithful. She said that whenever she tried to pray, an overwhelming force inside her resisted. At times, she smelled terrible odors that no one else could detect. She described them as the smell of burning or decay. Medical professionals called these olfactory hallucinations, but to her, they felt very real. She also began to feel as if her body was no longer under her control. There were moments when her voice changed in tone. She sometimes spoke harshly and aggressively, completely unlike her normal personality. Afterward, she often did not remember what she had said. Her family noticed that she was becoming more and more unpredictable. Doctors grow confused. By the early 1970s, Anneliese had been admitted to psychiatric hospitals multiple times. She underwent brain scans, neurological tests, and psychological evaluations. Yet no treatment seemed to help. Doctors insisted that everything she was experiencing could be explained through mental illness and epilepsy. They increased her medication, believing that stronger doses would eventually stabilize her. But instead of getting better, she became weaker. She complained that the voices in her head were becoming clearer. According to her, they no longer whispered, they shouted. They insulted her, threatened her, and told her she was damned. She began to fear that something evil was happening to her. A deeply religious family faces fear. For the Michel family, these changes were heartbreaking. They had always trusted doctors and modern medicine, but as months turned into years with no improvement, they slowly began to wonder whether something else might be happening. Anneliese herself started to believe that her problem was not just physical or psychological. She told her parents that she felt attacked from the inside. As devout Catholics, the idea of spiritual suffering was not unfamiliar to them. Still, they were hesitant to think of anything supernatural. They continued to follow medical advice, hoping for a cure. But the situation kept getting darker. The final months before everything changed. By 1973, it was clear that Anneliese Michel was no longer the same person she had once been. The cheerful schoolgirl had turned into a frightened, exhausted young woman who felt trapped inside her own body and mind. Her seizures continued. Her depression deepened. The strange voices and visions became a regular part of her life. She began to withdraw completely from normal society. Friends rarely saw her anymore. She spent most of her time at home with her family. Simple daily activities became difficult. She felt constantly watched, constantly threatened by something unseen. Doctors still insisted that it was all due to mental illness. But Anneliese and her family were slowly starting to doubt that explanation. They had not yet reached the conclusion that would later define her tragic story. At this stage, they were simply desperate parents trying to save their daughter and a young woman desperately searching for answers. None of them could have imagined that this was only the beginning. The real nightmare had not yet fully begun. By the early 1970s, it was clear to everyone around Anneliese Michel that something deeply troubling was happening to her. What had started as occasional seizures and strange sensations had slowly transformed into a disturbing and frightening pattern of behavior. Her physical health, mental stability, and emotional state were all deteriorating at the same time. The once quiet, polite, and gentle girl was slowly disappearing. In her place was someone unpredictable, fearful, and increasingly difficult to understand. The voices become louder. One of the most terrifying changes in Anneliese's condition was the way the voices in her head began to evolve. At first, years earlier, she had described them as distant whispers, annoying, but manageable. Doctors had dismissed them as simple hallucinations caused by epilepsy or psychiatric illness. But by 1972 and 1973, these voices had become far more intense. She told her family that the voices were no longer random sounds. They had become clear, distinct, and aggressive. According to her, they insulted her constantly. They called her names, told her she was worthless, and claimed that she was damned forever. Sometimes the voices argued with each other inside her mind. Other times, they spoke directly to her, giving commands and making threats. She would sit alone in her room, covering her ears, crying and begging for them to stop, but they never did. Doctors increased her medications, believing stronger psychiatric drugs would silence the hallucinations. Instead, the opposite happened. The voices only grew stronger. Sudden personality changes. Another alarming development was the dramatic shift in her personality. People who had known Anneliese for years began to say they no longer recognized her. She became irritable and aggressive without warning. Small things would trigger extreme reactions. A simple conversation could suddenly turn into shouting or hysterical crying. There were moments when her facial expressions seemed to change completely. Her family described times when she would look at them with cold, angry eyes that didn't feel like her own. She also began to isolate herself. Once a dedicated student and a loving sister, she now preferred to stay locked in her room for hours. She stopped meeting friends. She avoided social gatherings. Even being around her own family sometimes seemed unbearable to her. Her mother later said it felt as if another person was slowly taking over her daughter. Hatred toward religious objects. Perhaps the most confusing part of her transformation was her growing reaction to religious symbols. This was especially shocking because Anneliese had always been deeply religious. Faith had been a central part of her identity since childhood. But now, something strange began to happen. Whenever she tried to pray, she felt overwhelming anger and discomfort. She told her parents that the very act of praying caused intense pain inside her head. If she entered a church, she sometimes became dizzy or panicked. Looking at a crucifix made her feel physically ill. At one point, she even began tearing rosaries apart and throwing them across the room, actions completely opposite to her former behavior. Doctors believe these reactions were psychological, possibly connected to stress or inner conflict. But to her family, it felt like something far more disturbing. Unexplained physical strength. As the months passed, Anneliese began showing sudden bursts of unusual physical strength. During some of her episodes, she became almost impossible to control. Her parents described moments when this small, fragile young woman could push away multiple people at once. Nurses at hospitals reported similar incidents, saying that restraining her during seizures was becoming more and more difficult. At other times, she would throw furniture, hit walls, or injure herself without seeming to feel pain. These episodes confused medical professionals. Epilepsy could explain seizures, but it did not fully explain the extreme aggression and strength she was displaying. Something about her behavior no longer fit neatly into any medical category. The beginning of self-destructive behavior. By 1973, Anneliese's condition had reached a frightening new level. She began harming herself in shocking ways. During her fits, she would bite her own arms until they bled. She scratched her face and body violently. She banged her head against walls and floors. After these episodes, she often had no memory of what she had done. Even more disturbing were the new compulsions that developed. She started eating things that were not food paper, insects, even coal. On several occasions, she drank her own urine. These acts horrified her family, who could not understand what was happening to their daughter. Doctors labeled this behavior as signs of severe psychosis, but no treatment seemed capable of stopping it. Hallucinations grow more intense. Along with the voices, Anneliese began to experience terrifying visual hallucinations. She claimed to see demonic faces staring at her from walls and ceilings. Sometimes she saw shadowy figures standing beside her bed at night. She described them as dark, threatening shapes that filled her with absolute terror. She begged her parents not to leave her alone, especially after sunset. At times, she screamed that these figures were trying to drag her away. Medical professionals believed these were classic symptoms of schizophrenia or severe epilepsy-related psychosis, yet the medications they prescribed had almost no effect. Her hallucinations continued, growing more vivid and more frightening. Repeated hospitalization. Throughout this period, Anneliese was admitted to psychiatric hospitals again and again. Doctors ran every test they could think of. Brain scans, neurological exams, psychological evaluations, all were performed multiple times. Each time the conclusion was the same: temporal lobe epilepsy, severe depression, possible schizophrenia. Psychotic episode. She was prescribed a long list of powerful medications, including antipsychotics and anti-seizure drugs. But instead of stabilizing her, the medications often left her exhausted, confused, and emotionally numb. Her parents began to feel helpless. They followed every medical instruction carefully, trusting the experts completely. Yet year after year, their daughter only became worse. The family's growing desperation, watching Anneliese suffer day after day, slowly changed her family. Her mother spent countless nights sitting beside her bed, trying to comfort her while she cried in fear. Her father took her from one doctor to another, desperately hoping someone would find the right treatment, but no one had real answers. Relatives and neighbors began whispering about the strange things happening in the Michel household. Some suggested that perhaps the problem was not purely medical. At first, the family rejected such ideas. They believed firmly in science and modern medicine. The thought of anything supernatural seemed unrealistic and extreme. But as the situation became more hopeless, even they began to wonder. A mind and body falling apart. By 1974, Anneliese Michel was barely able to live a normal life. She struggled to eat properly, She slept very little. Her body was often covered in bruises and wounds from her violent episodes. She had to abandon her university studies completely. Her dreams of becoming a teacher were slowly fading away. What hurt her the most was the feeling that she was losing control over her own mind. In rare calm moments, she cried and apologized to her parents for the pain she was causing them. She would say things like, "I don't know what's happening to me. I feel like something is inside me. I'm not myself anymore." These statements deeply frightened those who loved her. Doctors run out of solutions. Medical professionals eventually reached a point where they had nothing new to offer. From their perspective, she was a tragic case of severe mental illness combined with epilepsy. They believed continued medication and therapy were the only possible solutions. But to her family, the medical approach was clearly failing. Years had passed. Countless treatments had been tried. Yet Anneliese was only getting worse, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The gap between what doctors believed and what the family was witnessing grew wider every day. The turning point. By late 1974 and early 1975, the situation reached a breaking point. Anneliese herself began to say something that changed everything. She told her parents that she no longer believed she was simply sick. She became convinced that what she was experiencing was not a normal illness at all. She started saying that she felt possessed. At first, her parents resisted this idea, but after years of watching unexplainable behavior, terrifying episodes, and failed medical treatments, they slowly began to consider the possibility that something spiritual, not medical, might be happening. This belief would soon lead them down a path that would change all of their lives forever. By the beginning of 1975, the Michel family had reached a point of complete desperation. For nearly 7 years, they had followed every instruction given by doctors and psychiatrists. They had trusted modern medicine completely, yet nothing had helped their daughter. Instead, Anneliese Michel's condition had only grown worse with time. What began as seizures and depression had turned into something far more disturbing, something that no hospital, doctor, or medication seemed able to control. The family now stood at a painful crossroads, losing faith in medical treatment. Throughout the early 1970s, Anneliese had been treated by numerous specialists. She had taken strong anti-epileptic drugs, heavy psychiatric medications, and undergone repeated hospitalizations. Doctors remained confident that her problems were neurological and psychological in nature. But the reality inside the Michel household told a different story. Despite years of treatment, the seizures continued. The voices became more aggressive. The hallucinations grew more terrifying. Her behavior became more violent and unpredictable. Her physical health weakened. Instead of healing, Anneliese seemed to be slipping further and further away from the person she once was. Her parents began to ask painful questions. How could so many years of treatment bring no improvement? Why did medications make her weaker instead of stronger? Why did her condition not follow any normal pattern of mental illness? Slowly, doubt began to replace trust. The family's inner conflict. Joseph and Anna Michel were simple, deeply religious people. They respected science and doctors, but their Catholic faith had always been the foundation of their lives. As they watched their daughter suffer, they found themselves torn between two worlds. The medical world, which insisted Anneliese was mentally ill. Their religious beliefs, which suggested something darker might be happening. For a long time, they refused to believe anything supernatural was involved. They feared being seen as irrational or uneducated. They wanted to believe that doctors would eventually find a solution. But after years of failure, their confidence in medicine slowly began to crumble. Anneliese herself started expressing thoughts that pushed them further in that direction. Anneliese's own beliefs began to change. Around 1974, Anneliese began telling her parents something that frightened them deeply. She said she no longer believed she was simply sick. During her rare moments of calm and clarity, she spoke about feeling as if something foreign was living inside her body. She described her experiences not as illness, but as attacks. She told them, "The voices are not in my head. They are real. There is something evil inside me. I feel like I am being controlled." At first, her parents thought these were just symptoms of psychosis, but the more they listened to her, the more they began to wonder. Her reactions to religious objects, her hatred toward prayer, and the strange personality changes no longer seemed like normal medical symptoms to them. The idea that something spiritual might be happening slowly took root. Seeking help from the church. As devout Catholics, turning to the church was a natural step for the Michel family. In late 1974, they quietly began speaking to local priests about Anneliese's condition. At first, They did not ask for anything extreme. They simply wanted spiritual guidance and comfort. Most priests they approached reacted cautiously. The Catholic Church does not easily accept claims of possession. Church authorities are trained to assume medical or psychological explanations first. Exorcism is considered only in extremely rare circumstances. Many clergy members advise the family to continue medical treatment and avoid jumping to supernatural conclusions. But a few priests agreed to meet Anneliese personally. First encounters with clergy. When priests began visiting the Michel home, they expected to meet a mentally ill young woman in need of comfort. What they witnessed instead left some of them deeply unsettled. During calm moments, Anneliese appeared normal, polite, shy, and respectful. But during her episodes, she changed completely. Priests reported that she reacted violently to prayers. She screamed when holy water was brought near her. She seemed unable to tolerate the presence of religious symbols. Her voice sometimes sounded harsh and unnatural. One priest later admitted that he had never seen anything like it before. Still, most church officials remained hesitant to draw supernatural conclusions. The church's official position was clear. Possession could only be considered after every possible medical explanation had been ruled out. The church's strict requirements. Before the Catholic Church allows an exorcism, very strict conditions must be met. There must be clear signs that cannot be explained by mental illness, such as speaking in languages the person never learned, displaying knowledge they could not possibly have, extreme reactions to sacred objects, supernatural physical strength, behaviors far beyond psychological explanation. At this stage, church authorities believed Anneliese's case did not yet meet those requirements. They sympathized with the family, but they continued to insist on medical treatment. This left the Michels in an agonizing position. Doctors were failing them. The church was reluctant to help them, and Anneliese continued to suffer. The situation becomes unbearable. By early 1975, Anneliese's condition reached new levels of severity. Her violent episodes increased. She injured herself repeatedly. She refused food for long periods. She screamed for hours at a time, claiming demons were tormenting her. Her parents felt completely powerless. They watched their daughter waste away physically and emotionally. Nothing they did, medical or spiritual, seemed to bring relief. Neighbors began to notice strange noises coming from the house. Some heard terrifying screams late at night. Rumors started to spread through the small town. The Michel family felt increasingly isolated and alone. A priest begins to take the case seriously. During this desperate period, one priest in particular began to pay closer attention to Anneliese's situation, Father Ernst Alt. Father Alt had met Anneliese several times and was deeply moved by her suffering. Unlike many others, he did not immediately dismiss the possibility of a spiritual cause. He spent long hours talking with her and observing her behavior. Over time, he became convinced that what he was witnessing could not be explained purely through psychology or medicine. He believed there were genuine signs that something unnatural was occurring. However, he still needed official church approval before anything could be done. Growing conviction of possession. As months passed, more unusual incidents occurred. Anneliese reportedly began speaking in voices that did not sound like her own. At times, she seemed to recognize people she had never met before. She reacted violently whenever prayers were said over her. According to witnesses, she sometimes used languages she had never studied, including fragments of Latin. These events strengthened the belief of Father Alt and the Michel family that they were dealing with something beyond ordinary illness. For them, the idea of possession was no longer unthinkable. It seemed to be the only explanation left. The request for official exorcism. In mid-1975, after much hesitation, the Michel family and Father Alt decided to formally request permission from the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism. This was not an easy step. They knew such a request would be controversial. Many people would judge them harshly. Doctors would likely accuse them of abandoning proper medical care. But from their perspective, they had no other options left. They prepared detailed reports about Anneliese's behavior, her medical history, and the strange occurrences that had taken place over the years. These reports were sent to the Bishop of Würzburg, who had the authority to approve or deny an exorcism. The church investigated. The bishop did not make a quick decision. Before granting permission, the church conducted its own investigation. Priests and religious experts reviewed medical documents and interviewed witnesses. They wanted to be absolutely certain that exorcism was truly necessary. For months, the case was studied carefully. During this time, Anneliese's condition continued to worsen. Her family feared that if help did not come soon, she might not survive much longer. permission is finally granted. In September 1975, after long deliberation, the Catholic Church finally made a decision. The Bishop of Würzburg officially authorized an exorcism for Anneliese Michel. This approval meant that the Church believed there were enough signs to consider the possibility of demonic possession. 2 priests were assigned to carry out the ritual: Father Arnold Renz, Father Ernst Alt. For the Michel family, this decision felt like a final hope. They believed that at last, someone was taking their daughter's suffering seriously. They hoped that spiritual intervention would succeed where medicine had failed, the beginning of a new chapter. With the Church's permission granted, the path ahead was set. What followed would be a long, painful, and controversial series of exorcism rituals that would last for many months. The family believed they were finally fighting the true cause of Anneliese's torment, but none of them could have imagined how tragic the outcome would ultimately become. This moment marked the end of the medical battle and the beginning of a spiritual one that would shock Germany and the world. By September 1975, after years of medical treatment and failed interventions, Anneliese Michel's family finally received permission from the Catholic Church to conduct an exorcism. 2 priests, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt, were assigned to carry out the ritual. What began as a cautious hope soon evolved into an intense, grueling ordeal that would last months, pushing Anneliese and her family to the limits of endurance. Preparations for the ritual. Before the exorcisms began, extensive preparations were required. The priests studied Anneliese's medical history, observed her behavior, and documented her episodes. They also prepared ritual materials, including holy water, crucifixes, and prayer books, readying themselves for a long and unpredictable process. The family transformed part of their home into a space suitable for the ritual. Doors were kept locked, furniture was moved to prevent injury, and rooms were arranged to allow the priests to perform the exorcisms with some degree of control. The atmosphere was tense, heavy with fear, anticipation, and uncertainty. Even at this early stage, it was clear that Anneliese's participation in the process would not be voluntary. Her episodes were unpredictable, violent, and exhausting. The priests and her family had to be vigilant at all times. The first rituals. The initial exorcism sessions began slowly and cautiously. At first, the priests attempted to engage Anneliese in prayer, speaking in calm tones and offering blessings. For short periods, she responded with quiet gestures or compliance, but these moments were brief. Soon her behavior escalated dramatically. She would scream, curse, and shout phrases in languages she had never studied, including Latin. According to witness accounts, she sometimes spoke in multiple voices, as if more than one consciousness inhabited her body. This was particularly alarming because it was unlike anything her family or even trained clergy had seen before. During these early rituals, she would thrash violently, breaking furniture, tearing clothing, and injuring herself. The priests were forced to restrain her physically, a task made difficult by her sudden bursts of unusual strength. Reports describe her strength as inhuman, and she would often resist all attempts to calm her. Physical and psychological strain. As the exorcisms continued, Anneliese's body began to deteriorate rapidly. Her episodes lasted for hours, sometimes consuming entire nights. She refused to eat and drink, either because of extreme fear or because she believed the entities inside her forbade it. Her weight dropped dangerously low. Her arms, legs, and torso were covered with bruises, cuts, and scratches from her violent movements. Psychologically, she became more unstable. She alternated between moments of lucidity and extreme terror. At times, she would weep uncontrollably, apologizing to her parents for the suffering she was causing. Other times, she would scream curses, threatening the priests and anyone who tried to intervene. Her parents were powerless, watching helplessly as their daughter's condition worsened day by day. Medical experts later noted that Anneliese's physical weakness during this period was extreme. She appeared emaciated, with a body showing clear signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. Her condition became increasingly critical, yet the priests were convinced that she was engaged in a spiritual battle that required their continued intervention. Language and knowledge beyond learning. One of the most extraordinary and controversial aspects of the exorcisms was Anneliese's use of languages she had never learned. During certain sessions, she spoke fluent Latin, often in harsh, commanding tones. She also recited prayers and phrases in other ancient languages, including fragments of Hebrew. Observers described these utterances as chilling and sometimes incomprehensible, adding to the sense that something beyond ordinary human experience was occurring. Additionally, she sometimes revealed knowledge she could not have possibly acquired through ordinary means. She would name people, events, or details that were completely unfamiliar to her, leading some to believe that the entities inside her possessed supernatural awareness, while skeptics argued these phenomena could be explained by memory, subconscious learning, or dramatic behavior. Her family and the priests interpreted them as evidence of possession. These instances reinforced their belief that medical science alone could not resolve her suffering. The escalation of violence. As the weeks passed, the exorcism sessions became increasingly intense. Anneliese's violent behavior escalated, sometimes involving entire hours of screaming, flailing, and self-harm. She would strike walls, bite her own arms, and scream in multiple voices. Her physical strength during these episodes made it extremely difficult for the priests and family to restrain her safely. Observers noted that her reactions to holy objects, prayers, and religious rituals were extremely strong. She would spit, curse, and thrash whenever a crucifix or holy water was brought near her. At times, she would bite, scratch, or hit anyone who approached. These episodes were exhausting for everyone involved and physically dangerous. Her family and the priests described a sense of complete helplessness during these moments. They could not predict when the next violent episode would occur or how long it would last. Nights were particularly difficult, as the rituals often lasted until dawn. Fasting and malnutrition. Anneliese's refusal to eat and drink became a critical concern. For long stretches, she consumed almost nothing. Her malnutrition was exacerbated by the violent nature of the exorcism sessions, which drained her energy and prevented her body from recovering. She lost weight rapidly and became dangerously weak. Despite these signs, the priests insisted on continuing the rituals. They believed that the spiritual battle could not be abandoned. Her parents, torn between fear for her life and faith in the exorcism, supported the priests' work even as they watched their daughter suffer. This period of prolonged fasting and malnutrition would later become a key factor in medical and legal assessments of her death. Psychological torment. The exorcisms were not only physically exhausting, they were psychologically devastating. Anneliese's terror during the sessions was profound. She screamed continuously, claimed she was being attacked by unseen forces, and begged for relief. At times, she accused her parents and the priests of harming her or conspiring against her. Witnesses reported that her demeanor alternated unpredictably. One moment she could be pleading and repentant, the next moment angry, aggressive, and defiant. These extremes contributed to a sense of chaos and helplessness for everyone involved. Her mental state became increasingly fragile. Medical experts later observed that prolonged exposure to such extreme stress can induce severe psychological and physical breakdowns, particularly when combined with malnutrition and chronic illness. Duration and intensity. Between 1975 and 1976, Anneliese underwent approximately 67 documented exorcism sessions. Each session could last for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. They occurred in her home, and occasionally priests would perform multiple sessions per day when they believed the spiritual entities were particularly aggressive. The duration and intensity of these rituals placed immense strain on everyone involved. The priests were exhausted, working long hours in high-stress conditions. The family was emotionally drained, constantly worried for Anneliese's safety and well-being. And Anneliese herself was caught in an unrelenting cycle of fear, pain, and deprivation. Self-harm during rituals. During exorcisms, Anneliese frequently harmed herself. She would scratch her arms, legs, and torso until she bled. She would bite herself and bang her head repeatedly. Observers described her behavior as desperate and uncontrolled. She seemed to experience intense pain, yet continued the actions as if compelled by forces beyond her own will. These moments became increasingly concerning to her parents. They knew she was physically weakening and feared that she might not survive much longer. Yet the priests interpreted the self-harm as further evidence that the demonic entities were resisting the exorcism. Family and community observations. Neighbors and relatives observed the changes in Anneliese during this period. Strange noises, screaming, and violent behavior became regular occurrences in the Michel household. Some described hearing phrases in Latin or other languages coming from her room. Others reported seeing her thrown across furniture or moving in ways that seemed impossible for her weakened body. The family was under intense scrutiny. Some people sympathized with them, while others whispered that they were engaging in dangerous and misguided practices. Despite criticism and fear, the Michels remained committed to what they believed was the only way to save their daughter. Controversial nature of the exorcisms. From a medical and legal standpoint, the exorcisms were highly controversial. Doctors maintained that Anneliese's symptoms were clearly consistent with epilepsy, psychosis, and severe depression. They argued that continued fasting, physical restraint, and prolonged ritual could have disastrous consequences. The priests, however, were convinced that they were battling forces beyond human understanding. They believed that abandoning the rituals would leave Anneliese vulnerable to permanent harm by the entities they identified as possessing her. This tension between medical intervention and spiritual practice created a situation that was increasingly unsustainable. The human cost. By the summer of 1976, nearly a year after the exorcisms began, Anneliese's physical condition had deteriorated dramatically. She had lost a dangerous amount of weight. Her body showed clear signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. Her energy levels were almost non-existent. She could barely walk without support. Psychologically, she was exhausted. Continuous terror, self-harm, and hallucinations had taken a severe toll. She remained alert at times, but much of her awareness was consumed by fear and distress. Her parents, exhausted and emotionally battered, continued to support the exorcisms, believing this was their daughter's only chance for salvation. By mid-1976, Anneliese Michel's situation had become unbearably severe. After nearly a year of grueling exorcism rituals, the young woman was physically frail, mentally exhausted, and emotionally broken. Despite the prayers, rituals, and constant spiritual interventions, her body could no longer sustain the relentless cycle of fasting, self-harm, and extreme stress. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save her had reached its tragic conclusion. The final days. In the months leading up to her death, Anneliese's physical condition was critical. She weighed only about 68 pounds, 31 kilograms, a dangerously low figure for a young adult woman. She suffered from extreme dehydration, malnutrition, and physical exhaustion. Her body showed extensive signs of injury, with bruises, scratches, and sores covering her limbs and torso from repeated self-harm and violent episodes during the exorcisms. Anneliese's family tried to support her, but their efforts were constrained by the nature of the rituals and the priest's insistence on continuing. She often refused food and drink, claiming that the entities inside her forbade her from consuming them. The priests and her parents interpreted this as further evidence of possession. To them, her suffering was not simply physical, it was spiritual. In her final days, she reportedly became even more withdrawn and weak. Friends and distant relatives who visited noted that she seemed almost ghostly, fragile as if her very body were being consumed by her ordeal. She could barely move, and her once bright eyes appeared hollow and fearful. The day of her death. On July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel died at the age of 23. The official cause of death, according to medical authorities, was malnutrition and dehydration, compounded by her chronic epilepsy. Her emaciated body weighed only about 68 pounds, reflecting the extreme physical decline she had experienced over the past year. Her parents and the priests were devastated. They believed, however, that she had finally been freed from the tormenting entities that had plagued her. From their perspective, her death was not merely a medical tragedy, it was the culmination of a spiritual battle. They maintained that the rituals had been necessary, that Anneliese's suffering had been real, and that she had been a victim of forces beyond ordinary comprehension. For outsiders, however, her death raised urgent questions. How could a young woman die in her own home under the supervision of family and clergy? Why had medical treatment been insufficient, ignored, or overridden? These questions would soon form the basis of one of the most notorious trials in Germany's post-war history. The investigation begins. Following Anneliese's death, German authorities launched a criminal investigation. Her parents, Josef and Anna Michel, and the two priests, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt, were immediately under scrutiny. The investigation aimed to determine whether her death was the result of neglect, abuse, or intentional harm. Autopsies confirmed severe malnutrition and dehydration as the immediate causes of death. There were extensive marks of bruising and injury, consistent with the physical rigors of the exorcism sessions. Physicians noted that her epilepsy, while serious, had not directly caused her death. Rather, it had been compounded by her weakened state. The case became a national sensation. Newspapers and television reports covered it extensively, raising widespread public debate about the intersection of faith, medicine, and legal responsibility. Many people were shocked that a young woman could die in what appeared to be a domestic religious ritual. Legal charges. In December 1976, the state charged Anneliese Michel's parents and the two priests with negligent homicide. Prosecutors argued that their actions or inactions directly contributed to her death. Key allegations included allowing her to refuse food and water, continuing physically exhausting and violent rituals, failing to seek medical intervention despite clear signs of life-threatening malnutrition, exposing her to extreme psychological and physical stress over months. The defense argued that the defendants acted out of sincere religious belief and with the intention of helping Anneliese. They claimed that the exorcisms were a spiritual necessity and that the participants believed she was possessed by demonic entities. The priests and her parents maintained that they might have acted in what they believed was Anneliese's best interest. Courtroom drama. The trial, held in 1978, drew enormous media attention. Reporters, legal experts, clergy, and medical professionals all followed the proceedings closely. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness a case that seemed to blur the boundaries between faith and law, spiritual belief and medical ethics. During testimony, experts described Anneliese's medical history in detail. Doctors recounted her chronic epilepsy, mental health struggles, and deteriorating physical condition. Psychiatrists emphasized that her symptoms could have been managed through medication, hospitalization, and proper nutrition. They argued that failure to intervene contributed directly to her death. Meanwhile, witnesses described the exorcism sessions in harrowing detail. They testified about the intensity, violence, and psychological distress involved. The priests and parents defended their actions, insisting that Anneliese's suffering was real and that the exorcisms were conducted with the hope of saving her soul. The court's verdict. After months of deliberation, the court reached a verdict in 1978. Joseph and Anna Michel, along with fathers Renz and Alt, were found guilty of negligent homicide. They were sentenced to 6 months in prison, which was suspended, and 3 years of probation. The court recognized the defendants' sincere religious intentions, which influenced the relatively lenient sentences. However, the court emphasized that their actions, continuing the exorcisms without adequate medical supervision, had directly contributed to Anneliese's death. The trial became a landmark case in Germany and around the world. It highlighted the tension between religious belief and medical responsibility, raising profound ethical questions that remain relevant today. Public reaction. Public reaction to the case was mixed. Many sympathized with the Michel family, understanding their desperation and devotion to faith. Others criticized the parents and priests for placing religious conviction above human life. Newspapers debated whether the case represented a failure of medicine, law, or both. The case also sparked discussion about the Catholic Church's role in exorcism. Critics argued that the Church should enforce stricter oversight to prevent similar tragedies. Supporters maintained that exorcisms are a legitimate spiritual practice, and that this was an unfortunate but rare outcome. The debate continues to this day, reflecting the ongoing tension between faith and science, tradition and modernity, medical and psychological analysis. In the years following Anneliese Michel's death, medical professionals have extensively studied her case. Analyses suggest that her condition involved multiple overlapping factors. Temporal lobe epilepsy contributed to seizures, hallucinations, and abnormal behavior. Severe depression exacerbated her withdrawal, refusal to eat, and emotional instability. Psychotic episodes, possibly triggered by prolonged stress, medication, and malnutrition. Malnutrition and dehydration, a direct factor in her physical decline and death. Prolonged psychological trauma, induced by violent exorcism rituals and sustained fear. Experts debate whether her condition could have been fully managed with medical treatment alone. Many conclude that the combination of epilepsy, psychiatric vulnerability, and extreme ritualized stress created a situation that was almost impossible to survive. The priest's perspective. Fathers Renz and Alt have consistently defended their actions. They argue that they were acting in accordance with the Church's teachings and with sincere concern for Anneliese's spiritual well-being. They maintain that they did not intend to harm her physically, and that her death was an unfortunate outcome of a situation beyond their control. They continue to insist that the rituals were necessary to confront what they believe to be a true case of demonic possession. Their perspective highlights the deep conflict between religious belief and modern legal and medical frameworks. The family's perspective. Anneliese's parents, Joseph and Anna, have also expressed continued grief and justification for their actions. They describe years of helplessness as doctors failed to provide a solution and believe that spiritual intervention was their only option. They maintain that they acted out of love, trying to save their daughter from forces they believed were real. Their narrative underscores the profound human struggle between faith, hope, and the limitations of medical science. Legacy of the case. The case of Anneliese Michel continues to influence discussions in multiple fields, law and ethics. It serves as a landmark example of the legal responsibilities of parents and clergy in cases where faith and health intersect. Medical practice. Doctors use the case to study the consequences of untreated psychiatric and neurological conditions. Religious studies. Scholars examine the cultural and spiritual context of exorcism and belief in possession. Popular culture. While the story has been fictionalized in films, documentaries, and books, the real events remain a powerful cautionary tale about the human cost of unaddressed mental illness and extreme spiritual practices. Reflections on faith, medicine, and responsibility. The tragedy of Anneliese Michel forces us to confront profound questions. What responsibilities do parents and religious authorities have when a person is suffering physically and mentally? How should medical advice interact with religious belief? At what point does faith, when pursued without oversight, become harmful? Anneliese's life and death exemplify the delicate balance between belief, medical ethics, and human compassion. Her story is not only about tragedy, it is also about the limitations of human understanding when science and spirituality collide. Remembering Anneliese. Today, Anneliese Michel is remembered both as a victim and as a symbol. Victim of her medical conditions, the extreme rituals she endured, and the circumstances that led to her untimely death. A symbol of the dangers of unmoderated faith when it intersects with untreated illness and psychological vulnerability. Her story is studied in medical, psychological, and theological circles alike. It continues to serve as a warning of what can happen when desperation, religious belief, and medical neglect intersect in tragic ways.